quick word from this week's sponsor, Ground News. War often brings out the most heated and polarising perspectives, and the news we read and the news we miss heavily influences our outlook on those types of issues. This is why I'm happy to be partnering with Ground News again for this video. They're an app and website that gather related news articles from around the world and political spectrum in one place. For example, let's take a look at this story on a recent airstrike conducted by Israel in Beirut. I can instantly access all 340 articles Ground News has found reporting on it, and see most of this coverage is coming from centre-rated and from highly factual sources. Comparing coverage is interesting. The bias comparison shows that left-leaning sources, including this article by PBS News, tend to emphasise international calls for de-escalation and restraint. This is a completely different perspective than the right-leaning sources, such as The Telegraph, tending to emphasise the justification for prosecuting this target. It's interesting to read the news in this way, where the origin of a source can heavily dictate the narrative, especially when social media feeds often tailor what we see to our political viewpoints, reducing diversity of perspective. Check it out at ground.news/operations room to make sure you're getting all sides of every story. They're giving my viewers 40% off their Vantage subscription, the same plan I use for unlimited access. I think Ground News is doing important work, and I hope you'll check them out. It's 8:05 AM on the 22nd of October 1944. A large fleet of 32 warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy is leaving Brunei Bay bound for the Philippines archipelago. This is the most powerful Japanese surface fleet to ever sail into combat, with 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 15 destroyers under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. Towering over the rest of the formation are the super battleships Yamato and Musashi. Their massive 18.1-inch guns at the ready. These mighty warships will spearhead the last major offensive of the Imperial Japanese Navy against the United States. They are en route to the Leyte Gulf, where they are about to take part in what some consider to be the largest naval battle in military history. Kurita's warships are just one cog in a massive plan which represents the final attempt of the Japanese Empire to stave off total defeat. When the war in the Pacific began, Japan reigned supreme as the dominant naval power in the Pacific region. However, the decisive defeat at Midway in 1942 permanently crippled the Imperial Navy, which was soon worn down by successive campaigns of attrition. 4 months earlier, in June of 1944, the once vaunted Japanese naval aviation arm was essentially wiped out during the largest carrier engagement ever, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Although the bulk of Japan's remaining aircraft carriers managed to escape, the Imperial Navy is on its last legs as the Allies draw closer to the home islands. After capturing the Mariana Islands, the United States sets its sights on retaking the Philippines, its former imperial possession. Under General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Theater of Operations, the US Navy's 3rd Fleet under the command of Admiral Bull Halsey will begin Operation King II, with a landing on the central island of Leyte on the 20th of October 1944. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet will provide direct support for the invasion forces, while Halsey's more powerful 3rd Fleet will defend against any attacks from the Imperial Japanese Navy. American, Australian, Filipino and Mexican forces will take part in the liberation of the Philippines. The Japanese Supreme War Direction Council knows the next Allied offensive is imminent. Combined Fleet Commander Admiral Toyoda draws up 4 Shogo or victory plans, each detailing how the Japanese fleet will respond to an attack. Operation Show 1, the contingency plan to defend the Philippines, is activated on the 18th of October after US Army Rangers land on several small islands in the Leyte Gulf in preparation for the main Allied assault. Show 1 is a high-risk, high-reward plan. The remaining strength of the Imperial Navy is split into 3 prongs. Northern Force under the command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, Center Force under Vice Admiral Kurita, and Southern Force led by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. The entire operation hinges on Ozawa's Northern Force, which comprises Japan's last combat-worthy aircraft carriers. However, the Northern Force is intended as a decoy. The idea is to use the carriers as bait to draw Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet away from the Leyte Gulf. If everything goes according to plan, the centre and southern forces will converge on the American landing beaches together and wreak havoc in the Allied rear. Many of the Japanese officers tasked with carrying out this mission are not confident they will succeed, but they all agree it must be attempted. No one is more unhappy than Admiral Ozawa, who is considered Japan's most competent naval officer. His 4 carriers have been drained of most of their air wings and will only carry 108 aircraft into the coming battle. But Ozawa intends on carrying out his task no matter how impossible the odds. On the 20th of October, the first Allied troops hit the beaches of Leyte, fulfilling General MacArthur's promise to return. 2 days later, Admiral Kurita's centre force and Admiral Nishimura's southern force leave Brunei Bay and head for the Philippines. Led by Musashi and Yamato, Centre Force represents the most powerful Japanese unit in the operation, and will cover the shortest distance to the Leyte Gulf through the Sibuyan Sea before transiting the San Bernardino Strait. Nishimura's force will swing to the south to attack through the Surigao Strait. Ozawa's decoy force will leave southern Japan on the 24th in the hope of drawing off the powerful Third Fleet. Just after midnight on the 23rd of October, Kurita's Centre Force warships are passing to the west of the island of Palawan. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Palawan Passage is being watched by multiple American submarines. 2 of them, USS Data and USS Dace, are surfaced within yards of each other, and its captains are chatting through megaphones, when Data's radar detects unidentified vessels at 1:16 am. Her skipper, Commander David McClintock, shouts to his counterpart on Dace, "We have radar contact, let's go." Data and Dace close their distance to the Japanese centre force on the surface, before submerging to periscope depth. McClintock opts for an attack at dawn so he can properly identify the vessels, and the 2 submarines continue to stalk their prey throughout the hours of darkness, staying just ahead of the enemy warships. More importantly, the submarines report the sighting to the US Pacific Fleet. As the sun rises, Commander McClintock decides that now is the time to attack. Kurita's centre force is split into 2 columns. USS Data will attack the port column first, while Dace will wait to hit the starboard column. At 5:24 am, Data fires all 10 of its bow torpedoes from close range at the leading Takao-class heavy cruiser. She then swings hard to port to fire the stern torpedo tubes. As Data is turning, 4 loud rumbles shake the submarine. She has hit Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, which erupts into flames. 10 minutes later, Data fires a spread of 4 torpedoes from her rear tubes at Atago's sister ship, Takao. Commander McClintock orders up periscope and can't believe his luck. He recalled, the sight of a lifetime. The cruiser was a mass of bellowing black smoke from number 1 turret to the stern. Bright orange flames shot out from the side along the main deck from the bow to the after turret. Takao takes 2 direct hits while Atago capsizes and sinks just 18 minutes after she was struck. Admiral Kurita is forced to swim before he is rescued and moves his flag to Yamato. Although she will survive, Takao is badly damaged and must be escorted back to Brunei. Now it's time for USS Dace to play her part. She lines up a shot on the heavy cruiser Maya and fires 6 torpedoes. Like Data, Dace swings to port to expose her rear torpedo tubes for another attack, but before she finishes her turn, 4 of the torpedoes strike the Maya, which immediately explodes. The crew of Dace listen to the sounds of Maya's magazines detonating, sending her to the bottom in only 5 minutes. Destroyers move in to pick up survivors and launch depth charges against the 2 American submarines, but both Data and Dace escape without damage. They will stalk the wounded Takao until Data runs aground 2 days later and is abandoned. The Battle of the Palawan Passage results in 2 Japanese heavy cruisers sunk and another crippled. Over 1,000 Japanese sailors are killed, and Operation Show 1 is off to an ominous start. Although the centre force has suffered a setback, Kurita's warships continue east into the Sibuyan Sea. USS Data's contact report reaches Admiral Halsey early in the morning on the 24th of October, and the Third Fleet prepares for battle. At 6 am, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 38 launches scout aircraft to search for the Japanese. Mitscher is still furious after the bulk of the enemy fleet escaped destruction at the hands of Task Force 38, then known as Task Force 58, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. His fast carrier force is the most powerful naval unit in the world, and he, along with Admiral Halsey, are obsessed with destroying the Japanese Navy once and for all. At 7:46 am, a Helldiver scout aircraft from the USS Intrepid spots the wakes of large ships south of Mindoro Island. Centreforce has been found again. However, the Japanese will strike first on this day. From 8 am, the ships of Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman's Task Group 38.3 detect 3 separate waves of between 40 and 60 unidentified aircraft, each approaching from the west. A Hey Rube call goes out to warn of an imminent enemy strike, and the combat air patrol of 12 Hellcats protecting Task Group 38.3 is quickly reinforced by 42 fighters from the carriers Lexington, Langley, Princeton and Essex. Among these are 7 Hellcats of VF-15 from Essex, led by Commander Dave McCampbell, who already has 21 kills to his name so far in the Pacific War. The American fighters fly off to meet the attackers, which are land-based aircraft from Luzon. Commander McCampbell leads the 7 Hellcats from Essex to intercept the third and largest wave of 60 aircraft, while the other American fighters engage the first and second waves. At 8:33 am, VF-15 attains visual on the formation. Approximately 30 Japanese Zero and Oscar fighters are flying at 14,000 feet, while the torpedo aircraft and bombers are maintaining course at a lower altitude. Although his aircraft are outnumbered almost 9-1, McCampbell directs a pair of Hellcats to attack the bombers while he and the rest of the squadron climb to dogfight the fighters. However, a miscommunication leads to the exact opposite result. 5 of the VF-15 Hellcats dive on the bombers, leaving McCampbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, alone to face the Zeros and Oscars. McCampbell and Rushing climb to 25,000 feet to meet the Japanese fighters. The Japanese formation is caught by surprise and immediately runs for home, exposing their rear to the Hellcats. The 2 American pilots get to work shooting them out of the sky. The Japanese pilots seem completely leaderless, and their paralysis makes McCampbell and Rushing's jobs easy. One after another are set on fire and plummet into the sea. After only a few minutes, McCampbell has shot down 4 fighters, while Rushing tallies 2. The Japanese formation finally gains their bearings and assume a defensive formation called the Loughborough Circle. The Zeros and Oscars form a large circle which allows them to provide mutual support for each other. The 2 Hellcats try to penetrate the formation but are driven off. After a few passes, they decide to climb and loiter above the circle, waiting for the fighters to run out of fuel. As McCampbell would later put it, "We climbed to light a cigarette and await further developments." Meanwhile, the other fighters from Essex have also forced the bombers to retreat and are picking them off one by one. After a few more passes, the Japanese fighters get low on fuel and are forced to break up. With the enemy strung out, McCampbell and Rushing pounce on the Zeros and Oscars again. Joined by another VF-15 Hellcat, the 3 pilots massacre the Japanese aircraft. McCampbell shoots down another 5 fighters, bringing his total for the day to an astonishing 9 kills. Rushing ends the dogfight with 6 fighters shot down, and altogether VF-15's 7 Hellcats destroy 24 of the 60 enemy aircraft. Along with the 5 kills he scored on the 19th of June during the Marianas Turkey Shoot, Commander McCampbell becomes the only American airman in history to achieve Ace in a Day status twice. He will be awarded the Medal of Honor. The rest of the Task Group 38.3 fighters are similarly successful at defeating the enemy raids, and it looks as if the task group will get away unscathed. However, just as the Combat Air Patrol is returning to their carriers at 9:38 am, a single Judy dive bomber breaks through the cloud cover and catches the American anti-aircraft gunners off guard. The Judy drops its 550-pound bomb on the light carrier USS Princeton. The bomb penetrates 4 decks and explodes inside the ship's bakery. The blast also ignites fuel in the hangar bay, which soon detonates stored aerial torpedoes. Despite the raging fires, the Princeton's crew continues damage control operations, while the light cruiser USS Birmingham pulls alongside to help with firefighting. Approximately 30 minutes earlier at 9:10 am, while the dogfights were still ongoing, the fleet carrier USS Intrepid and the light carrier USS Cabot launched 21 Hellcat, 12 Helldivers, and 12 Avenger torpedo aircraft against the Japanese center force. After Admiral Halsey received the report of enemy warships sailing through the Sibuyan Sea, he flashed a short order to his task group commanders: "Strike, repeat, strike, good luck." However, 3rd Fleet's carriers are too spread out to launch a large coordinated strike. Instead, task groups 38.2, 3 and 4 will take turns attacking center force with smaller groups of aircraft throughout the day. At 10:26 am, the 45 strike aircraft from task group 38.2 locate the main enemy fleet. With visibility perfect and no enemy aircraft providing air cover, Intrepid and Cabot's bombers launch into the attack. Center Force's battleships and heavy cruisers are arranged in 2 columns flanked by a screen of destroyers. The Helldivers and Avengers are greeted by a hail of enemy fire, especially from Yamato and Musashi, which boast 319 anti-aircraft guns between the two of them. The 2 super battleships also fire Sanshikidan shells at the incoming attackers. These rounds are fired from the 18.1-inch gun turrets and contain shrapnel and incendiary anti-aircraft shells, which shower the target airspace with flaming debris. However, despite the heavy volume of fire, the Japanese anti-aircraft weaponry isn't greatly effective, and the pilots consider the Sanshikidan shells to be little more than amusing fireworks. The strike aircraft press the attack as 8 Helldivers target Musashi. The mighty warship is struck by an armor-piercing bomb which fails to penetrate the 11 inches of steel plating on the roof of turret number 1. However, 4 Avengers launch a torpedo attack from the starboard side. 2 of the aircraft are shot down, but the other 2 manage to launch their torpedoes. One impacts Musashi amidships, and despite her armoured belt, she takes on 3,000 tons of water and develops a list. At the same time, Yamato takes a bomb hit, but this causes little damage. However, the heavy cruiser Miyoko is struck by a torpedo which damages the starboard propeller. Unable to keep up, she is forced to limp back to Japan for repairs. An hour and a half later, another strike of 30 aircraft from Intrepid arrives overhead. Noticing that Musashi has a slight list, the American aircraft gang up on her. 8 more Helldivers scream in and score 2 direct hits, one which penetrates 2 decks and detonates above the port engine room. Musashi loses power to her inboard propeller and her speed drops from 27.5 knots to 22. 9 Avengers launch an anvil attack on the wounded ship, with 4 approaching from the starboard side and 5 from the port. The portside Avengers score 3 hits, one of which forces the abandonment of the portside engine room. The super battleship is now starting to fall behind the rest of Center Force, as her crew counter-floods her to keep her from capsizing. At 1:30 PM, 54 aircraft from the fleet carriers Lexington and Essex spot Center Force and once again focus their attention on Musashi. 29 dive bombers and torpedo aircraft line up on her while 2 Hellcat fighters strafe the massive superstructure, causing casualties on the deck. The relentless Helldivers hit her with 4 more bombs near the forward turrets, while the Avengers score 4 hits on the starboard side. Extensive flooding further reduces Musashi's speed to 20 knots, while her bow is down 13 feet. Yamato is hit by another bomb, and the battleship Nagato is struck by 2, but they are not seriously damaged. A larger strike of 69 aircraft from Task Group 38.4 dives into the attack at 2:55 PM. This time, 9 Helldivers from USS Enterprise score 4 direct hits on Musashi, which is now listing heavily to starboard. Noticing this, the Avengers launch an attack from this direction, and 3 more torpedoes slam into her, cutting her speed to just 13 knots. With fires raging on board and the list rapidly increasing, Musashi is in a desperate shape. Yet, there will be no reprieve, as yet another 37 aircraft from Intrepid, Cabot, and the fleet carrier USS Franklin are en route to deliver the killing blow. Meanwhile, American damage control parties continue to work tirelessly to extinguish the fires aboard USS Princeton. Their efforts appear to pay off. By 3 p.m, the flames have been mostly contained. But unbeknownst to the crew, the fire is creeping towards the stern torpedo magazine. Just when it looks like she will survive, a massive explosion blows Princeton apart at 3:23 p.m. The light cruiser Birmingham suffers extensive damage, having been alongside to assist in damage control efforts. With the flames out of control, Princeton is scuttled 2 hours later. Altogether, 341 American servicemen are killed, of which 233 are from the Birmingham. The final American attack finds center force at 3:15 p.m, and the strike aircraft immediately get to work pounding the crippled Musashi. While heavy anti-aircraft fire shoots down 3 Avengers and 3 Helldivers, the rest line up to finish her off. 12 Helldivers plant 7 bombs on Musashi's deck, while the 9 Avengers take advantage of her reduced speed to score 8 torpedo hits. By this point, she has taken 18 bomb hits and 19 torpedoes, a punishment that no ship in the world can survive. The US strike group withdraws, while Admiral Kurita decides to leave the stricken Musashi to her fate and presses on towards the San Bernardino Strait without her. By this time, the Japanese Southern Force has also been spotted and attacked by US Navy aircraft, but only 1 destroyer is sunk and the rest of the group is not seriously impeded. With the sun setting over the Philippines, both sides take stock of the situation. After sailing east for another hour, Rear Admiral Kurita decides that it is hopeless for Center Force to continue the operation in the face of overwhelming American air power. Although he had been promised fighter cover from bases on Luzon, only 4 Japanese Zeros have arrived to provide combat air patrol. Furthermore, Kurita has no idea whether the other 2 prongs are still in the fight because of radio silence imposed on the operation. Thus, at 4:30 p.m, Kurita orders Center Force to reverse course and retreat out of range of enemy aircraft. An American scout aircraft spots the enemy fleet retiring to the west, just as another important discovery is made. 10 minutes later, a US 3rd Fleet scout reports that he has spotted enemy aircraft carriers to the north, Vice Admiral Ozawa's decoy force. With this news, Admiral Halsey believes the decisive moment has arrived where he can finally destroy Japan's last carriers. Earlier in the day, Halsey and his subordinates had created Task Force 34, a powerful formation of 4 fast battleships, 5 cruisers and 18 destroyers. The purpose of this force was to block the San Bernardino Strait against Center Force should it attempt to break into the Leyte Gulf. But, after the report that Center Force is retiring, Halsey feels confident that the San Bernardino Strait is safe. Because Japan has always based its most powerful striking forces around its aircraft carriers, the Northern Force appears to be the main threat. He prepares to chase the enemy fleet to the north. At this time, Kurita's Center Force is sailing past the mortally wounded Musashi, which continues to take on water. Captain Kenkichi Kato is attempting to beach the ship on the nearest island, and Kurita dispatches a heavy cruiser and 2 destroyers to escort her. Nonetheless, it soon becomes apparent that the dying Behemoth won't make it to shore. At 7:15 p.m, Kato orders the crew to abandon ship and hands his final combat report to his executive officer, intending on going down with the ship. When the XO refuses and states he would like to join the captain, Kato angrily responds, "My responsibility is so great it can't even be compensated by death, and I must share the ship's fate." But the executive officer is responsible for taking the crew to safety and getting them aboard a 2nd and 3rd Musashi to avenge today's battle. The XO leaves, and at 7:36 p.m, Musashi rolls over and sinks, taking 1,023 men to the bottom with her. Despite the loss of one of his most powerful warships, Kurita is suddenly feeling more confident about his chances to breach the Leyte Gulf. For some reason, no more American aircraft have come to attack Center Force. He also feels an obligation to at least attempt to rendezvous with the Southern Force if they are still advancing towards the Leyte Gulf. At 6:14 p.m, Kurita orders his warships to reverse course and head for the San Bernardino Strait. even without Musashi, Center Force still represents the most powerful surface squadron in Japanese naval history. They head east, hoping to put the massive guns of Yamato and the 3 remaining fast battleships to good use. 250 miles to the southeast, the Southern Force is approaching the Surigao Strait as night falls over the Philippines. Beyond the strait are the American landing beaches on Leyte. With the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro leading the way, Admiral Nimishura's formation is a formidable adversary. Yet, the Japanese are sailing right into a trap, as 6 US Navy battleships and scores of heavy cruisers await their unsuspecting foes. The last naval battle fought by the guns of battleships is about to begin. Just a quick word before we move to part 2. I just want to say a big thank you to our supporters on Patreon. Your support is the only reason we can make series like this, which take a huge amount of effort and work to produce by a growing team of 15 people. If you'd like to support what we do and get exclusive benefits such as early access to our videos ad and sponsor free, please consider joining our Patreon. We would love to have you as part of our community. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura is standing on the bridge of the battleship Yamashiro as the 30,000-ton dreadnought rounds the southern tip of the island of Palawan in the Philippines. Joining Yamashiro is her sister ship Fuso, along with the heavy cruiser Megami and 4 destroyers. The time is 10:50 PM on the 24th of October 1944, and this is the Southern Force of Operation Show 1, the last attempt of the Japanese Imperial Navy to halt the Allied advance towards the home islands. Nishimura's warships are heading into the Surigao Strait, the southern entrance to the Leyte Gulf, when they hear the sound of small boat engines. The Japanese sailors open the shutters on their searchlights and shine them to the north. There, they make out the tiny profiles of 39 US Navy patrol boats, which appear to be launching a surprise torpedo attack. The Battle of Surigao Strait, the last battleship versus battleship combat in naval history, has begun. The previous day saw the beginning of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The remnants of the Japanese Imperial Navy have been split into 3 prongs, northern, central and southern. So far, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Center Force has borne the brunt of the fighting after losing 3 cruisers and the super battleship Musashi in the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. To the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy force has been discovered by scout aircraft from Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet, which contains the vast majority of the US Navy's most powerful units. Believing that Ozawa's force is the main threat, Halsey signals his formation commanders at 8:22 PM on the 24th, ordering them to pursue and engage the enemy force. In reality, these 4 Japanese aircraft carriers have already lost most of their air wings. 2 hours later, Halsey informs the commander of 7th Fleet, Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, that he is moving north and intends to attack the Japanese carriers. 7th Fleet will now fight alone. The role of Kinkaid's 7th Fleet is to provide close naval gunfire support to the US Army landings on Leyte, and therefore his force does not include powerful fleet carriers like those of Halsey's 3rd Fleet. However, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's bombardment group includes 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, and 39 PT boats, a force which can pack a major punch if they find themselves in close quarters combat. With the departure of Halsey's 3rd Fleet, Admiral Kinkaid is now informed that a Japanese squadron is attempting to transit the Surigao Strait to attack the vulnerable landing beaches. He detaches Oldendorf's bombardment force warships, formerly Task Group 77.2, and sends them south to block the Japanese path. Kinkaid has also been led to believe that Halsey has detached Task Force 34, comprising fast battleships, from his main force to block the northern entrance to the Leyte Gulf, the San Bernardino Strait. In reality, Halsey hasn't done this. Not realising that his northern flank is actually completely unprotected, Kinkaid orders Oldendorf to move off to ambush the southern force before they make it through the Surigao Strait. Oldendorf's warships are all that stand between the Japanese southern force and the Allied landings. Meanwhile, the commander of the Japanese southern force is under no illusions that he and his men are likely headed to their deaths. Earlier on the 24th, a Japanese floatplane reported American warships massing around the Surigao Strait. In order to transit the narrow opening, Rear Admiral Nishimura's warships will have to form in a single file line, meaning Oldendorf's battleships have already crossed the T, which places the Japanese at a massive disadvantage. Nishimura had expected to be reinforced by Vice Admiral Shima's 5th Fleet, consisting of 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser and 4 destroyers, but Shima has been lagging behind Southern Force. Nishimura has decided not to wait for these reinforcements, and Shima won't be able to provide adequate support in the coming battle. Southern Force presses on anyway. Nishimura's only son was killed 2 years earlier, and many of Southern Force's officers believe their leader sees this operation as a chance to join him in death. As it stands, Oldendorf's warships are ready to grant this wish. At just before 11 PM, 39 patrol boats under the command of Lieutenant Commander Robert Leeson launch an attack on the far larger enemy vessels. Leeson's fleet of small but fast PT boats have a twofold mission. They are to harass and distract the Japanese, while also reporting their position so Oldendorf can adjust his formation accordingly. Splitting into 3 ships, the PT boats slash through the waters of the Surigao Strait, while the Japanese warships fire star shells and sweep the ocean with their searchlights in order to bring their guns to bear on the Americans. A PT boat captain records what he is seeing, reporting, "I've got 1 big one in sight. My god, there are 2 more big ones, and maybe another." Nishimura's warships open fire with their main and secondary batteries, but the PT boats are frustratingly hard to hit. Columns of water erupt around the small patrol craft, but little damage is caused. 10 boats are hit, and only one, PT-493, is severely damaged. With the tiny vessel taking on water, PT-493's skipper beaches her on Palawan Island. When the rest of the boats are in torpedo range, each fires their 4 torpedoes and head back to safety. These hit-and-run attacks last for the next 3.5 hours, the PT boats putting constant pressure on the Japanese fleet. Despite the brave assault, no torpedo hits are scored, and Southern Force continues heading through the Surigao Strait with their formation intact. However, Nishimura's luck is about to turn as Admiral Oldendorf orders his destroyers into action. At 2:30 AM, Captain Jesse Coward leads Destroyer Squadron 54 into the fray, with 3 coming down the eastern side of the Surigao Strait, while 2 hug the western shore. Following just behind are the 6 destroyers of Captain Kenmore McCain's Destroyer Squadron 24 in 2 columns. Assigned to McCain's force is the Australian destroyer HMAS Arunta, which is attacking the Japanese formation from the port side. Finally, Captain Roland Smoot's 9-ship Destroyer Squadron 56 will attack in 3 columns. Combined, these destroyers carry an impressive arsenal of 214 torpedoes. At just before 3 AM, the Japanese destroyer Shigure reports 3 unidentified ships steaming through the darkness at a range of 5 miles. Yamashiro's powerful searchlights train on the lead American destroyer, the USS Remy, making the exposed crew feel like animals in a cage. Captain Coward immediately assigns targets as the Japanese warships once again open fire, the flash of heavy guns lighting up the night sky. The destroyers press forward for another 3 minutes to close the range while shell splashes erupt all around them. One of the destroyer captains later wrote of the experience, "I have never been in a quieter, more tense atmosphere than existed from the moment we started down." At 3 AM, Destroyer Squadron 54 is close enough to launch torpedoes. USS Remy, McGowan and Melvin fire 27 torpedoes before breaking off to the northeast at flank speed. On the bridge of each destroyer, the officers stare at their stopwatches to time the distance to impact. 8 minutes later, 2 torpedoes from the USS Melvin strike the battleship Fuso amidships, which destroys her boilers. The stricken battleship falls out of formation as its speed is cut nearly in half. The heavy cruiser Mogami nearly collides with Fuso as she begins listing to starboard. 2 minutes later, the destroyers McDermott and Monson fire their torpedoes, with McDermott targeting the Japanese destroyer column and Monson the Yamashiro. Meanwhile, Fuso is attempting to continue the mission, but the large battleship is taking on water at an alarming rate. At 3:18 am, her commanding officer decides to break off the engagement and retreat to the south to allow Fuso's crew to perform damage control. 2 minutes later, the second spread of 18 torpedoes find their targets. The destroyer Yamagumo takes 2 hits and is vaporized by a magazine explosion, sinking within minutes. Of her crew of 200, only 2 survive. Destroyer Michishio takes 1 torpedo, which leaves her dead in the water. Asagumo has her bow blown off, but her crew is able to hold the flooding, allowing the wounded destroyer to retire to the south. One of Monson's torpedoes strikes battleship Yamashiro on her port side near the aft turret magazine. Her crew floods the magazine to prevent an explosion, but Yamashiro's speed is cut in half like her sister ship Fuso. However, a far worse fate is about to befall Fuso. As the damaged battleship retreats to the south, she is being shadowed by 2 PT boats which are reporting her position. At 3:38 am, the waters of the Surigao Strait are suddenly brightened by a tremendous explosion. Lookouts aboard the American battleships 25 nautical miles to the north are amazed by the ball of fire which rises into the night sky. It is not known what caused the final explosion, but the battleship Fuso sinks in just 12 minutes. Of the 1,630 sailors aboard, only 10 survive the oil fire. Unaware of the disaster, Admiral Nishimura attempts to radio Fuso at 3:52 am, but receives no response. Nonetheless, he continues to charge forward through the narrow waters of the strait. Nishimura is also hopeful that Admiral Shima's 5th Fleet will catch up and help Southern Force break through to the Leyte Gulf. The wounded Japanese formation staggers forth, but this time they are headed straight into the massed guns of 6 US Navy battleships, 4 heavy cruisers and 4 light cruisers. Aboard the USS West Virginia, the fire control officers in the Combat Information Center have been aching for a chance to get into battle. Finally, at 3:53 am, the approaching Japanese fleet closes within 26,000 yards, into the range of West Virginia's 16-inch main batteries. The old battleship, which had been sunk during the attack on Pearl Harbor and then raised from the dead, fires a full salvo at Yamashiro, which is leading the enemy formation. The gunnery officer tracks the rounds before excitedly reporting a first salvo hit on the enemy battleship. 2 minutes later, fellow Pearl Harbor veteran battleships Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania and California, along with Mississippi, join the fray. Yamashiro is immediately straddled by fire, but is herself entirely blind to the enemy battleships. Within minutes, a salvo from Maryland smashes into the massive pagoda mast, which sets Yamashiro on fire. At the same time, the American cruisers have also found the range and are lobbing 8 and 6-inch shells at the Japanese warships. The USS Boise's gunnery officer doesn't even pause to track the fall of his salvos on radar, instead ordering the ship's batteries to engage the enemy with continuous rapid fire. In just 18 minutes, the cruisers alone will fire over 3,100 shells at the Japanese fleet. The main target continues to be Yamashiro, which is taking a pounding. The old battleship is now firing back with its 14-inch guns, but the lack of radar guidance is a serious disadvantage in night action. Despite this, she manages to straddle the light cruiser USS Denver and hits the destroyer Alan W. Grant with her secondary battery. At 4:08 am, Admiral Shima's fleet arrives at the southern end of the Surigao Strait and steams north to join the battle. Yet, the American fleet is simply too powerful. Aboard Boise, a loader breaks his hand loading shells into the gun breech, but fights through the pain as he continues to feed rounds into the gun. At this time, Admiral Nishimura radios Admiral Kurita and the Japanese center force. "We proceed till totally annihilated. I have definitely accomplished my mission as prearranged. Please rest assured." Yamashiro attempts to swing to port in order to unmask all 12 of her 14-inch guns, but this only makes her a larger target for marauding US destroyers. 2 more torpedoes slam into her, causing her to list heavily to port. Captain Shinoda finally gives the order to abandon ship, but very few crewmen make it to the lifeboats. At 4:19 am, just 26 minutes after the American battleships opened fire, Yamashiro capsizes and sinks to the bottom of the Surigao Strait. In a morbid coincidence, only 10 of her 1,636 crewmen survive the ordeal, just like her sister ship Fuso. Both Captain Shinoda and Admiral Nishimura go to the bottom with her. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Shima's fleet finally sails into combat just as Admiral Oldendorf orders ceasefire. After being hit by Yamashira's secondary battery, the destroyer Alan W. Grant has also taken friendly fire, which causes extensive damage to the ship. As such, an eerie silence falls across the battlefield, while the wrecks of Japanese warships continue to burn. Shima's flagship, the heavy cruiser Nachi, prepares to take advantage of the lull to launch torpedoes against the American battleships. As she is maneuvering to launch an attack, she sails across the smouldering hulk of the heavy cruiser Mogami. Believing the ship is dead in the water, Nachi's captain attempts to move ahead of her. However, Mogami is actually still making 8 knots, and Nachi's navigator badly miscalculates the approach. At 4:30 am, the two cruisers collide. Nachi's bow is damaged, and the cruiser begins to flood, but her damage control team manages to get the situation under control. Although Mogami has been hit above the waterline, the sparks from the collision ignite a fire on the deck, which quickly spreads and detonates the cruiser's torpedoes. Her starboard engine is destroyed, meaning the ship can only make a mere 4 knots at this point. Aboard Nachi, Admiral Shima scans the waters ahead and attempts to raise Admiral Nishimura, but there is no reply. He decides to retreat and call off Southern Forces' mission, later writing, "If we continued dashing further north, it was quite clear that we should only fall into a ready trap." Watching the radar screen aboard his flagship, the cruiser Louisville, Admiral Oldendorf notices that the surviving Japanese warships are withdrawing out of the Surigao Strait. Unwilling to quit the battle yet, Oldendorf gives chase with the cruisers Louisville, Portland and Denver, along with several destroyers, just as the pre-dawn sun begins to brighten the sky. The American sailors aboard the pursuing ships are appalled by the sight that greets them. A gunnery officer aboard the destroyer USS Benion wrote, "I counted 8 distinct fires, and the oily surface of the Gulf was littered with debris and groups of Japanese sailors who were clinging to bits of wreckage and calling out to us as we raced past." After 45 minutes, Admiral Oldendorf's force catches up with the stricken Mogami and the destroyer Asagumo, which has been rescuing survivors from the Fuso. The American cruisers once again open fire, this time focusing on Mogami. Between 5:30 and 5:35 am, the heavy cruiser takes more than 10 direct hits from 6 and 8-inch shells, but she refuses to sink. Her commander throws off the pursuers with a course change, and the American warships decide not to chase Mogami further. 3 hours later, her port engines will break down, leaving the ship dead in the water. Mogami will be attacked and bombed by American aircraft later in the morning, and at 10:47 am, she is scuttled by her crew. Asagumo meets a similar end. While she is still recovering survivors from Fuso, a squadron of patrol boats speed into a hit-and-run torpedo attack. The Japanese never spot the tiny craft before they launch their torpedoes. At 6:30 am, a torpedo from PT-323 strikes Asagumo amidships, leaving her adrift. Within half an hour, the light cruisers Denver and Columbia, along with 3 American destroyers, come across Asagumo, which opens fire. A short duel breaks out, but the Japanese destroyer's fate is already sealed. By 7:21 am, her bow is already awash, although her 5-inch guns continue to fire. A minute later, she slips below the surface. With no more Japanese warships in range, Oldendorf's ships form an anti-aircraft formation and steam south to look for more targets. His formation comes across scores of Japanese survivors bobbing in the water, but almost all of them refuse to grab a line. The captain of the destroyer USS Daly later recalled, hundreds of survivors were reported in the water, almost all of whom refused to be rescued and were left to their fate. Some of the Japanese sailors managed to swim to the islands of Leyte or Dinagat, only to be set upon by Filipino guerrillas. As vengeance for the brutal Japanese occupation of the Philippines, the guerrillas massacre the sailors with bolo knives. By late morning of the 25th of October, the Battle of the Surigao Strait is over. The last battleship-on-battleship action in naval history is a decisive victory for the US 7th Fleet. Of the 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser and 4 destroyers, which composed Admiral Nishimura's southern force, only the destroyer Shigure survived the engagement. Although there is no definitive number of Japanese casualties, it is believed that over 3,500 sailors in the Imperial Japanese Navy have perished during the battle. Meanwhile, the Americans suffer just 39 men killed and 144 wounded, while PT-493 and the destroyer Alan W. Grant are the only US Navy vessels seriously damaged during the engagement. The southern prong of Operation Show 1 has been wiped out. Off the island of Samar to the north, men aboard the small destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts are jubilant at the great victory. Nicknamed the Sammy B by her crew, Samuel B. Roberts is part of Task Unit Taffy 3, which is providing close support for the invasion of Leyte. Sailors on deck could see the distant fireworks to their south, while the men in the Combat Information Center listened to the battle on the radio. Amid cheering and applause, Executive Officer Bob Roberts turns to the skipper, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, and exclaims, "By God, I think we finally got him." However, unbeknownst to the crew of the Samuel B. Roberts and all of the men in Taffy 3, the most powerful Japanese surface fleet to ever sail into combat is heading right for them. In the morning, Taffy 3 will take part in one of the most desperate naval battles in history. At 5:45 am on the 25th of October 1944, a TBM Avenger, piloted by Ensign Bill Brooks, launches off the flight deck of the escort carrier USS St. Lo. Brooks is conducting an anti-submarine patrol off the island of Samar in the Philippines. The St. Lo is one of the 6 small escort carriers, 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts which compose Task Unit Taffy 3, which is just to the east of Samar. The 13 ships of Taffy 3 are a subunit of Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's US 7th Fleet, providing close support to General Douglas MacArthur's land forces as they stormed the island of Leyte. 3 more Avengers and 2 older Wildcat fighters fan out to the northwest to search for Japanese activity. However, a thick cloud cover prevents Brooks from observing the water's surface until just after 6:30 am, when he finally spots a break in the layer. He dives through the opening to 4,000 feet to discover a surprising sight. Below him are the darkened shapes of large warships steaming southeast towards Taffy 3's position. Believing this must be Admiral Bull Halsey's US 3rd Fleet, he remarks to his turret gunner, "Hey, look at that, Halsey must have come down from the north." His gunner responds, "Thank God they're on our side." Yet, the more Brooks studies the formation of ships, the more suspicious he becomes. There are no aircraft carriers among the 23 vessels in this fleet. If these are Halsey's ships, then where are the large fleet carriers? And despite his extensive training in ship identification, none of these vessels resemble any American or British warship type. Only when Brooks flies a little closer does he realise the horrible truth. This is a powerful Japanese surface force. As if to punctuate this realisation, anti-aircraft flak explodes around Brooks's Avenger, forcing him to take evasive action while he gets on the radio to warn Taffy 3. The small, undergunned and outnumbered task unit is about to be attacked by an enemy with overwhelming strength. The coming engagement will be one of the most desperate fights in the history of the US Navy. This confrontation is just one element of what some consider to be the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. 5 days earlier, MacArthur's Allied ground troops landed on the island of Leyte in the first phase of the American and Australian reconquest of the Philippines. To stop the Philippines from falling, the Imperial Japanese Navy sails out with the last of its strength. Split into 3 prongs, north, centre and south, the objective is for the centre and southern forces to penetrate the Leyte Gulf and destroy the Allied beachhead. In order to accomplish this, the northern force will act as a decoy to draw the US Navy away from Leyte, allowing the powerful surface forces in the other 2 formations to attack the landing beaches. Defending the invasion forces are the US 3rd and 7th Fleets. 3rd Fleet is under the command of Admiral Halsey and contains the bulk of the US Navy's best and largest warships, including Task Force 38, the most powerful aircraft carrier formation in the world. Vice Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet is less impressive, with mostly old battleships, a mixture of obsolete cruisers and destroyers, along with support ships including escort carriers. On the 24th of October, 3rd Fleet's aircraft ravaged Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force and sank the super battleship Musashi in the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. These losses forced Kurita to retreat with the rest of his warships. 7th Fleet has also demonstrated that it can still pack a punch. The Japanese southern force was annihilated by Kinkaid's battleships during the one-sided Battle of the Surigao Strait on the morning of the 25th of October. With these two victories, it currently appears that the Japanese naval offensive has been halted. Little do the Americans know, they are on the brink of disaster. With center force apparently defeated, Admiral Halsey orders 3rd Fleet north to attack a large carrier formation sailing from southern Japan, while Admiral Kinkaid's battleships guard the Surigao Strait. What Halsey doesn't know is he is falling right into the Japanese trap. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy force has been stripped of most of its air wings. Furthermore, Admiral Kurita's center force was spotted by American scout aircraft retreating away westwards, but, unbeknownst to the Americans, has since turned around and is heading back towards the San Bernardino Strait, the northern entrance to the Leyte Gulf. Because Halsey has taken all of 3rd Fleet north, the strait is left wide open and center force enters the Leyte Gulf at 3 AM without being detected. The reasons for this mistake are miscommunication and poor command structure. Halsey and 3rd Fleet are subordinated to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who is monitoring the operation from Pearl Harbor. This is in contrast to Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, which is under the direct command of General MacArthur due to its role supporting the invasion. As a result, neither fleet makes it a priority to communicate with each other. When Halsey announces he will head north to attack Ozawa's carriers, he does not directly inform Kinkaid, who only finds out from listening in on US naval communications to Admiral Nimitz. To make matters worse, Halsey has also promised to guard the San Bernardino Strait with his own Task Force 34, a formation of fast battleships, cruisers and destroyers. However, quite simply, he doesn't. He takes Task Force 34 north with 3rd Fleet, rather than blocking the strait, and Kinkaid is not notified. This perfect storm of compounding errors is about to lead to catastrophe, as the powerful surface fleet of Center Force bears down on Taffy 3, the hopelessly outgunned unit defending the entire Leyte landings. Taffy 3, comprising 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, must hold the line against 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers. Or these powerful surface vessels will have free rein to annihilate the American and Australian forces fighting on Leyte and all of their support vessels. As anti-aircraft fire shakes his aircraft, Ensign Bill Brooks sends an urgent warning on St. Lo's main radio frequency. Derby Base, enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 10 to 12 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of your task group and closing in on you at 30 knots. The report is overheard by Taffy 3's commander, Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, aboard his flagship the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay. Annoyed, Sprague assumes that an inexperienced aviator has misidentified an American surface force and calls down to Fanshawe Bay's Combat Information Center. Airplot, tell him to check his identification. Angered that his report is being doubted, Brooks drops to just 2,000 feet above the Japanese warships and overflies Admiral Kurita's flagship, the super battleship Yamato. Brooks navigates the storm of flak while his radio man snaps pictures of the enemy formation. He checks and rechecks the coordinates before calling Fanshawe Bay on the radio. I see the pagoda masts, and I see the biggest red meatball flag I ever saw flying on the biggest battleship I ever saw. At the same time, radio men aboard the ships of Taffy 3 begin picking up Japanese radio transmissions. The distant black puffs of flak bracketing Brooks' Avenger are now becoming visible to the American crews on deck. There is no doubt now. From Yamato's gunnery platform, Commander Tonosuke Otani is scanning the horizon and spots enemy aircraft carriers in the distance. He misidentifies the ships of Taffy 3 as 6 Essex-class fleet carriers escorted by 1 or 2 battleships along with 10 or more heavy cruisers. Rear Admiral Kurita can hardly believe his luck. The Japanese force has apparently stumbled upon the pride of the US Navy, its fast carrier force. Below decks, gun crews work feverishly to load massive 18.1-inch armour-piercing shells into Yamato's main battery guns. The rest of the Japanese warships also prepare to engage, unaware that they massively outgun their smaller, slower enemy. The mood on the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay is initially one of disbelief. Rear Admiral Sprague knows that his warships stand little chance against the Japanese force. Yamato herself displaces nearly 70,000 tons, almost as much as the combined weight of every ship in Taffy 3. This task unit is only intended to escort cargo convoys to the beachhead, carry out long-range recon patrols, and provide close air support for the fighting men on the ground. The 6 escort carriers combined carry a sizable contingent of over 150 aircraft, but they are almost entirely outfitted with anti-personnel and anti-submarine weaponry. Their high-explosive bombs and depth charges will do little against the enemy behemoths cresting the horizon. Despite the odds stacked against Taffy 3, Sprague concludes his only option is to fight. At 6:50 am, he orders every escort carrier to turn east into a strong wind. This heading will take them directly away from the enemy fleet towards a rain squall, where he might be able to find concealment. While his carriers are turning full into the wind, Taffy 3 goes to general quarters, and Sprague radios his carriers. Launch all planes as soon as possible. Although his aircraft won't be able to dent the enemy battleships and cruisers, Admiral Sprague hopes they will distract and confuse the Japanese force. The destroyers and destroyer escorts are ordered to lay a smokescreen and zigzag to shield the escort carriers from view. It takes just 5 minutes for the carriers to swing into the wind, while every pilot in Taffy 3 sprints to their aircraft. The Ordnance personnel equip Avengers and Wildcats with anything they can get their hands on, including rockets, high-explosive bombs, depth charges, and ammunition for their machine guns. In many cases, American aircraft are sent to attack the Japanese warships with nothing at all. At 6:59 am, Yamato opens fire with her main battery at a range of 20 miles, followed soon after by the battleships Nagato, Haruna, and Kongo. Splashes erupt near the escort carrier USS White Plains. The Battle of Samar has begun. At the rear of the American formation is the destroyer USS Johnston. Johnston's skipper is Commander Ernest E. Evans, who quickly sizes up the situation and, without waiting for orders, decides to attack. At 7 am, he addresses the crew from the bridge. All hands to general quarters, prepare to attack major portion of the Japanese fleet, all engines ahead flank. Commence making smoke and stand by for a torpedo attack, left full rudder. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony, Evans told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now." Now, he is leading them in a lone charge against the powerful Japanese surface force. Johnston peels off from the rest of Taffy 3 and charges right at the enemy fleet through a gauntlet of colourful shell splashes, the coloured dye meant to help the Japanese gunners aboard the battleships track their salvos. The small destroyer cuts through the waves and chases the splashes, hoping that the enemy won't fire at the same place twice. Aboard Yamato, Admiral Kurita orders a general attack against the American warships, at the same time Johnston begins her attack. This gives his individual captains the freedom to pursue the enemy how they see fit, but the order quickly leads to confusion as the Japanese fleet breaks up into several different columns. Despite its vast superiority over Taffy 3, Center Force is slow to begin a proper attack on the Americans. By the time the formation is sorted out, the Japanese heavy cruisers are leading the charge while the 2 divisions of 13 destroyers attempt to flank Taffy 3 from the east. Yet, as the destroyers begin to rapidly close the distance to the American carriers, Kurita orders them to the rear of the formation, afraid they will burn too much fuel chasing the enemy. It is a decision that will have massive consequences for the rest of the battle. At 7:04 am, Yamato straddles White Plains with a salvo. Although there are no direct hits, the shocks from the near misses from the 18.1-inch shells are enough to knock out steering, radar, and electrical power. Swift damage control is able to bring all of these systems back online within just 3 minutes. At the same time, the escort carrier USS Kalinin Bay is also targeted by the Japanese battleships. Lieutenant Earl Archer is third in line to launch, while the splashes of near misses drench the open cockpit of his Avenger. Archer is not a religious man, but he prays for the first time in his life. "Lord, please don't let me die sitting here on deck." Finally, when it's his turn to launch, he is able to take off as one of the few pilots with a full weapons loadout of bombs, rockets, and machine guns. At 7:10 AM, White Plains takes a direct hit from an 8-inch shell fired from a heavy cruiser. Luckily, the rounds pass right through the carrier like a bullet through paper. The armour-piercing shells fired by the Japanese warships are ill-suited for killing the lightly armoured escort carriers. Furthermore, this hit, along with the damage caused by Yamato, have thrown up black smoke from the funnel, which leads the Japanese gunners to believe the carrier has blown up. Center Force shifts its fire away from White Plains, which escapes any further damage. Meanwhile, Johnston continues her lone charge against the Japanese formation. Somehow, she has not been hit despite a torrent of shells impacting the water around her. At 7:10 AM, the destroyer finally closes to within 18,000 yards of the closest warship, the heavy cruiser Kumano, which is the flagship of the Japanese cruiser division. Commander Evans gives the order to fire, and Lieutenant Hagen opens up with Johnston's 4 5-inch guns. Aided by the excellent Mark 37 fire control computer, Johnston quickly scores several hits on Kumano, while continuing to sprint into torpedo range. Johnston's shells aren't large enough to sink the heavy cruiser, but her accurate fire devastates Kumano's thinly armoured superstructure. The destroyer is firing almost 80 shells a minute, and lands more than 40 hits on Kumano, while the Japanese heavy cruiser fails to score a single hit in return. Miraculously, Johnston is able to close to 10,000 yards and launches a spread of 10 torpedoes at Kumano at 7:18 AM. Commander Evans swings the destroyer hard to port and orders his vessel to head back to the main formation. While Johnston's torpedoes track towards Kumano, Taffy 3's aircraft begin their own desperate assault on the Japanese fleet. The pilots watch in awe as the lone destroyer continues to dodge and weave while it makes its way back towards the escort carriers. Approaching the column of enemy heavy cruisers, the pilots dive their aircraft in. Those carrying weapon loadouts drop whatever they have on the enemy vessels, a mixture of bombs, rockets, and depth charges. Aircraft without any weapons carry out dummy attacks to draw fire and force the Japanese vessels into evasive action, throwing off the aim of their main gun batteries. After pilots exhaust their ammunition, they join in the dummy attack runs, which are surprisingly having an impact. Every time the cruisers are forced to turn away from imaginary torpedoes or bombs, the range opens up between the Japanese and Taffy 3. When the aircraft are low on fuel, they break off and head for the Tacloban airfield on Leyte to refuel and rearm, given that there is no guarantee their carriers will still be afloat when the pilots have finished their attacks. Although the American fleet is improbably engaging the enemy fleet with some success, Admiral Sprague knows this will not last. At 7:16 AM, he orders Commander William Thomas aboard the destroyer USS Hull to turn around and lead a torpedo attack with the USS Heermann. On the bridge of the small destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Bob Copeland asks Commander Thomas over the radio, "Do you want the little fellows to go with the big little fellows?" Thomas replies immediately, "Your last transmission, negative." Despite being denied, Copeland looks around and sees that his small vessel is best positioned to peel off and join the attack on the incoming Japanese cruisers. Without any other orders specifying what he is supposed to do, Copeland gets on the intercom and addresses the crew. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. With that, he orders Samuel B. Roberts to turn and follow the attacking destroyers, nearly colliding with the Heermann in the process. Copeland calls down to the engine room. This is the captain. "We are going on a torpedo attack, and I have rung up full speed. I want you to hook on everything you've got." Lieutenant Bill Trowbridge orders the boiler tenders to turn off the boiler safety valves. Although she ordinarily sails at a top speed of 24 knots, Samuel B. Roberts achieves nearly 29 knots as she makes her way towards the enemy cruiser column. While Hull, Heermann, and Samuel B. Roberts close to make their attack, Johnston is still running away from the Japanese fleet, firing her 5-inch guns as she sails south. At 7:24 am, one of Johnston's torpedoes strikes Kumano, blowing off her bow. The flagship of the Japanese cruiser division falls out of formation. Although this is a survivable hit, she is done for the day. Hull, Heermann, and the Samuel B. Roberts are preparing their torpedo run. Hull is leading the loose formation while her captain, Commander Leon Kintberger, is also chasing salvos in an attempt to dodge enemy fire. Communications officer Lieutenant John Dix can't help but be impressed by his skipper's calm demeanour as he relays orders amid the intense fusillade. "Right full rudder, steady up, now left full rudder, give it all you've got." The zigzagging column rapidly closes the distance to the Japanese fleet. At 7:25 am, Hull's luck runs out when she is struck by a 6-inch shell from Yamato's secondary battery. The armour-piercing projectile scores a direct hit on the bridge, killing 4 and wounding Captain Kintberger. The fire control radar is also knocked out, meaning Hull's gunners are now firing by sight. Despite the damage, she is still in the fight, although Admiral Kurita believes he has just sunk an enemy cruiser. Captain Kintberger leads Hull and the other 2 attackers into a rain squall where they are temporarily out of sight from the Japanese warships. Meanwhile, USS Johnston's crew has no time to celebrate their improbable victory against Kumano. Just a minute after Hull is hit, an accurate salvo from Yamato screams in on the destroyer. She takes 3 direct hits from the massive 18.1-inch shells, which wreck the propeller gears, main steam turbine, and a boiler. 3 more 6-inch shells then impact the bridge, killing and wounding many in the pilot house. Commander Evans is peppered by shrapnel and loses 2 fingers off his left hand, but stubbornly refuses medical attention. Despite the devastation on deck, Johnston is still floating thanks in part to a lack of fuel on board, which prevents any serious fires. However, her superstructure is wrecked and her speed has been cut in half to about 17 knots. She limps into a rain squall while the crew performs damage control. As the wounded Johnston is fleeing into the squall, she runs across the 3 small American warships making their way towards the enemy column. The Hull, Heermann, and Samuel B. Roberts pass by Johnston, which is only operating on 1 engine. Despite Johnston's extensive damage, Evans watches the American column pass and decides that his ship is not done yet. He tells the officers on the bridge, "We'll go in with the destroyers and provide fire support." His stunned officers cannot possibly believe they can survive yet another run at the Japanese fleet, but they swing Johnston around to once again make an attack. Gunnery Officer Hagen later recalls saying to himself, "Oh dear lord, I'm in for a swim." Using her surface search radar, Hull continues to close the range while firing her 5-inch guns at the lead Japanese battleship, Kongo. Kintberger leads his vessel within 10,000 yards as the small destroyer duels with the 37,000-ton battleship. At 7:27 am, her torpedo tubes swing out to starboard and fire 5 torpedoes at the Japanese cruiser column. However, at this close range, the Japanese gunners are finding it easier to train on their target. Hull takes several direct hits, the most serious of which knocks out steering. The helmsman reports that the rudder no longer answers, as the destroyer begins an irreversible turn to port. Knowing that his ship is dying, Kintberger orders the crew to prepare to fire the rest of the torpedoes while they still can. The wounded Hull is battered by enemy shell fire as she circles uncontrollably, with Captain Kintberger hoping he can line up a shot before it is too late. To her rear, the Heermann, Samuel B. Roberts, and Johnston continue their attack run. Although she is sailing at only 17 knots and has no more torpedoes, Commander Evans spots the Japanese heavy cruiser Tone and gives the order to open fire with the 5-inch guns. At 7:37 am, Johnston scores several hits on Tone, despite having no surface radar, The battle is now quickly descending into confusion, resembling a barroom brawl more than a naval engagement. In the skies above, American aviators continue to attack the Japanese warships regardless of whether their weaponry is effective or not. A pilot from the USS Fanshawe Bay, Lieutenant Thomas Lupo, makes several attack runs in his Avenger until he exhausted of all munitions. With nothing left to fire at the enemy and his aircraft low on fuel, Lupo makes another pass and hurls whatever he has laying around in his cockpit at the Japanese warships, including a clipboard and an empty Coke bottle. Now, with quite literally nothing left to throw at the enemy, Lupo turns towards Tacloban Air Base in Leyte to rearm and refuel. Lieutenant Earl Archer of the USS Callanine Bay's VC-3 has also run out of ammunition, but nevertheless goes in for a dummy torpedo run with 2 other Avengers. They target a battleship, probably either Haruna or Congo. The aircraft next to him is blown apart in mid-air, and the explosion gives Archer a concussion. Rather than aborting the run, he pulls out his .38 caliber revolver and fires at the battleship's bridge as he pulls up over the superstructure. He can see the dumbfounded faces of the Japanese officers as he flies past taking potshots. These same officers are finding it difficult to concentrate on their own assault on Taffy 3 with the constant stream of American aircraft buzzing their ships. Kurita's operations officer, Commander Tonosuke Otani, would later write, "The attack was almost incessant. The bombers and torpedo planes were very aggressive and skillful, and the coordination was impressive." Aircraft from nearby task groups Taffy 1 and Taffy 2 have been alerted to the battle and are now beginning to arrive as well. Furthermore, the drifting smoke and scattered rain is reducing visibility across the battlefield, which reduces the effectiveness of the relatively primitive Japanese targeting equipment. The heavy cruiser division has nonetheless closed the distance to Taffy 3's escort carriers to just 8 miles, enough for a gunnery duel to break out between the cruisers and the USS St. Lo, which fires back with its single aft 5-inch gun. Aboard Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague has a crucial decision to make. His current course is keeping his escort carriers mostly within the rain squall, but the run to the east is also taking them further away from the American warships currently in the Surigao Strait. Consequently, he orders a turn to starboard, and his carriers now flee towards the south. This is a risky gamble. If the Japanese react quickly enough, they can cut off and flank Taffy 3. But Sprague knows he must get help soon or his ships will be finished. By 7:40 am, the American carriers are now heading south, while the escort force continues their desperate battle against the Japanese. Hull's first salvo of torpedoes misses the Japanese cruisers as she staggers back into torpedo range. This time, she is engaged by Yamato and the fast battleship Haruna. The destroyer is pounded by Japanese fire, taking more than 40 direct hits from shells of different calibers, from 5-inch secondaries to Yamato's main 18.1-inch guns. Kintberger realises it is now or never and gives the order, "Get set to fire, lead cruiser, all remaining fish, stand by, tube 2, train out to port, curve 5 ahead, quick now, we're swinging fast, all ready, fire." Her last 5 torpedoes leap out of their tubes at 7:50 am and head right towards Yamato. 4 minutes later, lookouts on board the massive super battleship report incoming torpedoes. She makes an emergency turn to port, successfully presenting a smaller profile and avoiding the torpedoes. However, this action has also taken her completely out of the battle at a crucial moment in the engagement. As the burning hull falls out of formation, the destroyer Heermann closes to within 9,000 yards of the Japanese cruisers. Captain Amos Hathaway gives the order to fire 5 torpedoes, but one of the exciting young tube trainers accidentally fires 2 more. The 7 torpedoes track towards the Japanese heavy cruiser Haguro as Heermann enters one of the several rain squalls drifting across the battlefield. She is faced by 4 Japanese battleships led by Haruna. Chief Yeoman Harold Whitney assumes his ship will be sunk on the spot, but Captain Hathaway attacks Haruna anyway. American pilots flying above the fray are treated to the comical sight of the small destroyer trading salvos with the Japanese battleship, which can't seem to hit the elusive Heermann. Haruna takes several direct hits from her 5-inch guns, causing fires along the superstructure, When she is in range for a torpedo attack, Heermann launches her last 3 fish and turns to get away. The torpedoes will miss, but like Yamato, Haruna is forced to take evasive maneuvers, which lessens her impact on the larger battle. Unbelievably, USS Heermann has not taken any serious damage despite attacking 4 battleships by herself. Despite the actions of the escort vessels, the American escort carriers are now well within range of Japanese guns. The USS Kalinin Bay takes the first of 15 direct hits at 7:50 am, when a 14 or 16-inch armor-piercing shell wrecks the hangar deck aft of the forward elevator. 10 minutes later, she begins an unequal duel with the heavy cruisers Tone and Haguro. She is struck by 3 more 8-inch shells, but manages to deal some damage herself. At 8:25 am, Kalinin Bay scores 2 direct hits on Haguro, forcing the ship to temporarily withdraw. But the Japanese barrage is merciless, and Kalinin Bay takes 15 shells from the enemy cruisers. Somehow, the escort carrier survives the onslaught and endures the punishment from the Japanese without losing speed. All of Taffy 3's carriers are now locked in a duel with the Japanese cruisers. The Japanese vessels continue to close the range, but the formation is acting cautiously, perhaps believing the escort carriers pack more of a punch than they actually do. Aboard the USS White Plains, a gunnery officer jokingly calls out, "Just hold on a little longer, boys, we're sucking them into 40mm range." With Hall and Heermann having completed their torpedo attacks, it's now time for the Samuel B. Roberts to make her own run at the Japanese vessels. As the destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts only carries 3 torpedo tubes, and Captain Copeland intends to make them count. Sailing through the swirling smoke and rain showers, the tiny vessel makes its way towards the Japanese cruiser line. When she closes within 13,000 yards of the leading cruiser, Gunnery Officer Bill Burton requests permission to open fire with the 2 5-inch guns. Copeland denies the request. He wants to get as close as possible without firing to surprise the Japanese. Nonetheless, a nervous Burton repeatedly asks, "Captain, may I open fire?" until an annoyed Copeland shouts back, "God damn it, Mr. Burton, I'll let you know when we may open fire." With visibility continually compromised by drifting smoke and rain showers, the destroyer escort's small profile is practically invisible to the Japanese cruisers, and she is able to close to within 6,000 yards. However, just as Executive Officer Bob Roberts is lining up the torpedo tubes, an errant shell smashes into the radio mast, which topples over and jams the tubes in place. With no time to fetch repair equipment, Roberts does a quick calculation in his head and shouts the targeting settings to the chief torpedoman. From just 4,000 yards away, Samuel B. Roberts fires its spread of 3 torpedoes and turns back to rendezvous with the rest of Taffy 3. Meanwhile, Heermann and Johnston narrowly avoid colliding with each other before forming up in a column. At 8:08 am, Heermann is firing starboard broadsides at the Japanese when the portside lookout shouts a warning to Chief Yeoman Whitney. Emerging from the smoke is a Japanese destroyer, which closes to within yards of the Heermann. Whitney later recalled that the other vessel was so close he could throw a potato across the gap between the 2 ships. He urgently recommends they engage the enemy destroyer at point-blank range, but Captain Hathaway is unfazed, responding, "I can't shoot at them now. We're busy with these cruisers over here." The Japanese warship also decides to fire at other targets, and for the next 16 minutes, the 2 vessels sail side by side, firing at their opposing fleets without attacking each other. By 8:10 am, the Japanese heavy cruiser Chikuma has begun shelling the escort carrier USS Gambia Bay, which is vulnerable and exposed. Spotting this through the haze, Captain Copeland aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts turns to his gunnery officer and finally relents. "Mr. Burton, you may open fire." The 2 5-inch guns erupt, and a duel between the heavy cruiser and the Samuel B. Roberts begins. Chikuma takes several direct hits, and is forced to split its fire between the small destroyer escort and the carriers. For the next 35 minutes, the destroyer escort peppers the Japanese heavy cruiser's superstructure with its 5-inch shells, firing so rapidly that she almost exhausts all 600 rounds aboard. Conversely, Chikuma simply cannot hit the small and nimble Samuel B. Roberts, which skillfully avoids its salvos. Just to the north, the ailing USS Johnston is doing its best to catch up when she emerges from a squall right in front of the battleship Haruna. Not one to shy away from the fight, Commander Evans engages the larger Japanese warship, sending 30 shells her way in just 40 seconds. Just like her heavily armed counterpart, Haruna proves incapable of hitting Johnston, even though she is steaming at half of her normal speed. Gunnery Officer Hagen would later write, "As far as accomplishing anything decisive, it was like bouncing paper wads off a steel helmet, but we did kill some Japanese and knocked out a few small guns." However, Commander Evans' attention is drawn to a new problem. The USS Gambier Bay is being pummeled. Johnston breaks off the engagement with Haruna and moves as fast as she can to save the embattled escort carrier. When the main bulk of Taffy 3 turned to the south, Gambier Bay found herself exposed on the port side of the formation. After taking fire for more than 90 minutes, she finally takes a direct hit at 8:20 am, which floods the forward engine room. Her speed drops from 18 knots to 11 knots, and she falls behind the rest of the escort carriers, while Japanese warships move in for the kill. On the bridge, signalman Don Herrick spots 3 American destroyers to the southeast, flashing a recognition signal from their carbon arc searchlights. These are from Taffy 2, which are racing northwards to reinforce Taffy 3. Herrick replies using Gambier Bay's searchlight shutters, "We are under attack, please help." The 3 destroyers acknowledge the request, but then immediately turn and retreat to the south. Taffy 2's commander is concerned that his own task unit will soon be overtaken by the Japanese warships and decides to recall his escorts. Gambier Bay and Taffy 3 will have to fend for themselves. At 8:26 am, Admiral Sprague radios his escorts. "Small boys on the starboard quarter, intercept enemy cruiser coming in on my port quarter." With Johnston still limping along on only one engine, Hull dead in the water, and the Samuel B. Roberts duelling with Chikuma, USS Heermann and Captain Hathaway answer the call. Kearman cuts across Taffy 3's formation, nearly colliding with Fanshawe Bay and Johnston. She then clears the burning Gambier Bay and comes face to face with the Japanese cruiser line led by Chikuma. Heermann's 5-inch guns once again open up on the Japanese, with immediate results. Having already taken damage from the Samuel B. Roberts, Chikuma is hit more than 50 times by shells from Heermann. One salvo strikes the heavy cruiser's seaplane hangar, which sets off a large explosion. By 8:35 am, the fires aboard the USS Hull have become out of control, and the destroyer is bracketed on 3 sides. The Japanese fleet gangs up on her, pounding the superstructure into scrap. With a heavy heart, Captain Kintberger orders the crew to abandon ship. With most of the electrical systems destroyed, Kintberger gathers his staff on the bridge and has them pass the word on in person. 20 minutes later, Hull sinks, taking 253 crewmen with her. Only 86 men, including Captain Kintberger, will survive the sinking. While the crew of the USS Hull is abandoning ship, Heermann continues to pound Chikuma, but her improbable luck does not hold forever. At 8:45 am, she takes multiple hits from 5 8-inch shells, the most serious of which directly impacts the pilot house. Chief Yeoman Whitney rushes in to find everyone inside cut down by shrapnel, including Chief Quartermaster John Milley, who was at the helm. With Heermann heading directly into the teeth of the Japanese fleet and no one controlling the ship, Whitney grabs the wheel and steers her away from danger. After a few minutes of chasing shell splashes, he feels a tug on his leg. Chief Quartermaster Milley is alive, albeit barely conscious and bleeding heavily. "I'll take it," he says before staggering to his feet. With no time to argue, Whitney allows Milley to resume the helm, where he stays for the rest of the battle. At the same time, Johnston has finally caught up with the Japanese cruisers firing on the stricken Gambier Bay. After closing to within 6,000 yards, Commander Evans turns to Gunnery Sergeant Bob Hagen and points at the Japanese heavy cruiser Haguro. "Commence firing on that cruiser, Hagen. Draw her fire on us and away from the Gambier Bay." Johnston lobs salvos towards Haguro and scores several direct hits, but the cruiser's captain has decided to ignore Johnston and focus on wrecking Gambier Bay. The Japanese gunners have also finally switched from armour-piercing to high-explosive rounds, which are far more damaging to the thinly armoured escort carrier. Johnston tries in vain to attract attention away from Gambier Bay, until a new threat materialises to the rear. 4 Japanese destroyers, led by the light cruiser Yahagi, are approaching to flank Taffy 3 from the north and cut off the task group's line of retreat. The Japanese destroyers have essentially been out of the fight since Admiral Kurita ordered them to the rear of the formation, but now they are lining up for an attack run with their dreaded Long Lance torpedoes. Seeing he can do little for Gambier Bay now, Commander Evans decides to focus on the bigger threat. The battered destroyer steams as fast as she can right at the enemy, as Gunnery Officer Hagen once again orders the batteries to open fire. For the 3rd time in this battle, Johnston engages multiple enemy ships by herself. Evans intends to get within 7,000 yards and cross the Japanese T as they approach. The American destroyer and the 5 Japanese warships exchange several salvos, with each side scoring hits. Yet, unbelievably, it is the Japanese who break first. After taking 12 direct hits from Johnston, the light cruiser Yahagi turns 90 degrees to starboard and launches her torpedoes at extreme range before beating a hasty retreat. The destroyer behind her is also immediately hit by a salvo, and withdraws as well after launching. With this, the entire Japanese column falls back out of range of Johnston's guns. The mood on her bridge is one of disbelief and amazement. Hagen would later recall, Commander Evans, feeling like the skipper of a battleship, was so elated he could hardly talk. He strutted across his bridge and chortled, "Now I've seen everything." Although the Japanese Long Lance torpedo is a lethal weapon, it is vulnerable while still en route to its target, and many of the torpedoes are destroyed by strafing fighters or anti-aircraft gunners aboard the American ships. None hit their targets, and the Japanese destroyer columns are out of the battle once again. However, the rest of Admiral Kurita's centre force has picked out a new target, the Samuel B. Roberts. At just before 8:50 am, Battleship Congo fires a 14-inch salvo, which explodes just off the Roberts' stern. Realising he is about to sail right into the next round of shells, Captain Copeland shouts into the voice tube to the engine room, "All engines back full." The destroyer escort essentially slams on the brakes while another salvo of 14-inch shells hit the water just yards in front, where she would have been. But this evasive manoeuvre has left Samuel B. Roberts stationary. At 8:51 am, she takes a direct hit from an 8-inch shell from one of the Japanese heavy cruisers. The shell damages her boilers, reducing her speed from 28 knots to 17. The rest of the Japanese fleet pounces on this much easier target, and soon the Roberts is suffering hits regularly. Captain Copeland's crew fights for their lives as their enemy bears down on them. The Japanese heavy cruisers are under relentless air attack around this time. Just as Samuel B. Roberts takes her first hit at 8:51 am, cruiser Chokai is taking a pounding not just from the American escorts, but also the lone 5-inch gun crew from the USS White Plains. With the anti-aircraft crews suffering heavy casualties, they fail to spot a lone TBM Avenger approaching. The Avenger drops a 500-pound bomb which penetrates and explodes in the forward machinery room. Chokai is now dead in the water and burning from bow to stern. Later in the day, she will be scuttled by the destroyer Fujinami, who picks up survivors, but is herself sunk 2 days later. None of the 773 men aboard Chokai will survive the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. The next blow comes quickly. At 8:53 am, 4 torpedo-armed Avengers from the USS Manila Bay, an escort carrier in Taffy 2, approach the heavy cruiser Chikuma head-on. They split off into an anvil formation. 2 torpedo aircraft attack from each side, which box in the cruiser. 3 of the torpedoes miss, but 1 impacts Chikuma, which blows her stern clean off. Her speed drops all the way to 9 knots, but more importantly, the ship's rudder is destroyed. Captain Saiji Norimitsu signals Admiral Kurita to inform him that Chikuma is uncontrollable. Further airstrikes later in the day hit her with at least 3 more torpedoes, and she sinks by 2 pm. In a cruel coincidence with the fate of Chokai, the survivors are picked up by the destroyer Nowaki, which is then sunk on the 26th of October. Only one of her 874 men survives. Nonetheless, Japanese vengeance is swift. Hull finally sinks at 8:55 am, and at 9 am, a 14-inch salvo from Congo screams in on the wounded Samuel B. Roberts, leaving the destroyer escort dead in the water and sinking. Although water is starting to slosh around the deck, she continues to fight. In the aft 5-inch gun, the crew has fired continuously for over an hour now, causing the gun barrel to glow red. Just as they shove the second to last round into the breach, the red-hot barrel prematurely detonates the shell. Machinist's mate 2nd Class Charma Koheen investigates to find a scene of devastation inside the turret. Only one man is still alive, gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr. However, Carr is grievously wounded, and Koheen can tell he won't live much longer. He attempts to move Carr, but the dying man refuses to leave his post, begging Koheen to help him load the last round still cradled in his arms. Every time Koheen takes the shell from Carr and sets it aside, he crawls over to pick it up. Eventually, Koheen is able to get Carr out of the turret, but he soon dies of his wounds. Paul Henry Carr will later be awarded the Silver Star. On the bridge, Captain Copeland knows his ship is finished, and tells the crew over the intercom, "Abandoned ship men, well done." By 10:07 am, the Samuel B. Roberts sinks, with the loss of 90 men out of the complement of 210. By 9 am, the heavily damaged escort carrier Gambia Bay has taken such punishment that most Japanese warships have ceased fire, content to let her sink. At 9:07 am, she capsizes and slips beneath the waves 4 minutes later. 147 men are killed, while 800 are eventually rescued. To this day, the USS Gambia Bay is the only American aircraft carrier to be sunk by enemy surface forces in the history of the US Navy. Meanwhile, Johnston continues her valiant but increasingly doomed battle against the Japanese. With Johnston, Hull, Gambia Bay, Samuel B. Roberts and Heermann all either sunk or badly damaged, there is now little to stop Centre Force from destroying Taffy 3 once and for all. However, a curious thing happens just as Gambia Bay disappears from view. The Japanese fleet begins turning north away from Taffy 3. Aboard Yamato, Rear Admiral Kurita has lost control of the battle. He has received conflicting reports about the strength of enemy units and how many have been sunk. His once tight formation is spread out over miles of ocean, with some columns heading in completely opposite directions. The constant attacks by American aircraft and the unyielding defence of Taffy 3 has also convinced Kurita that he is facing a more powerful force than he actually is. By 9 am, he has made up his mind to withdraw. He believes he has caused enough damage to what he thinks is the main American carrier force, and does not want to risk the destruction of the rest of his fleet. At 9:20 am, Admiral Kurita signals to the rest of his ships, "All ships, my course north, speed 20. With that, the threat to the Allied landing beaches on Leyte is over. When informed that the enemy fleet is retreating, Admiral Clifton Sprague is utterly incredulous. The escort carriers are still dodging errant Japanese torpedoes, but his tiny task unit has somehow emerged against a much larger fleet. On the USS Fanshawe Bay's bridge, a signalman shouts, "God damn it boys, they're getting away." Afterwards, Sprague would write, "I could not get the facts to soak into my blood-numbed brain. At best, I had expected to be swimming by this time." He watches with satisfaction as the rest of Taffy 1, 2 and 3's aircraft chase the enemy formation to the north. The USS Johnston is paying the ultimate price. Even with the Japanese formation retreating, they continue to fire at the barely floating destroyer. Commander Evans continues running up and down the deck giving orders, now completely bare-chested after his uniform is blown off his body. But at 9:40 am, one final salvo knocks out the last remaining engine, leaving her dead in the water. 5 minutes later, Evans gives the order to abandon ship. As the crew leaps into the water, the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze passes just off the starboard beam. Initially, the American sailors believe they are about to be machine gunned, but instead the crew of Yukikaze stands at attention while their captain salutes from the bridge. One survivor later said, "I'm sure of one thing, she appreciated a fighting lady." 25 minutes later, the destroyer sinks, taking 186 men with her. Among them is Commander Evans, who was last seen by a crewman on deck preparing to abandon ship. When the crewman looked again, he was gone, never to be seen again. For this leadership of the USS Johnston during the battle, Commander Ernest E. Evans is posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American in the US Navy to receive his nation's highest award for gallantry. The Battle of Samar is widely considered one of the greatest upsets in the history of naval warfare, as a small and hopelessly outgunned American unit of just 13 ships turned away the most powerful Japanese surface fleet to ever sail into combat. The costs for this unlikely victory are high. Approximately 2,000 US Navy sailors and airmen are killed or missing, with another 300 wounded. Almost every ship in Taffy 3 suffers battle damage, and 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort and 1 escort carrier are sunk by enemy action. Only an hour and a half after the Japanese withdrawal, the escort carrier St. Lo is hit by a kamikaze and sunk, the first time the enemy has employed their special attack squadron. There will be more to come. The Japanese also suffer heavily. 3 heavy cruisers are badly damaged and 3 more are sunk, including the Suzuya, which is later attacked and destroyed by American bombers. Altogether, 3,000 Japanese sailors are killed or wounded in the battle. More importantly, the Japanese Imperial Navy has just missed its last chance to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. Admiral Kurita has been heavily criticised for retreating just when victory was at hand, but many historians, such as James Hornfisher, contend that the lack of viable information made the decision defensible. Nonetheless, the fate of the Philippines and that of the Imperial Navy is now sealed. Far to the north, Admiral Halsey has received the alarming reports from the battle. His staff has been busy intercepting the signals from Admiral Kincaid, who has been keeping 3rd Fleet abreast of the action. With the US Navy's most powerful fleet too far away, there is little Halsey can do to help. Now he focuses on destroying the last of the Japanese aircraft carriers. The Battle of the Leyte Gulf is about to enter its final stage. The time is 7:10 AM on the 25th of October 1944. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa paces the bridge aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier Zuikaku, which is steaming south from Japan towards Leyte Gulf and the Philippines. Ozawa waits for reports from the rest of the Japanese fleet, which is carrying out Operation Shogo 1, the Imperial Japanese Navy's final attempt at turning the tide of the war in the Pacific theatre. As part of this plan, Japan's last remaining aircraft carriers are to be offered up as bait to draw away Allied naval forces from their task of protecting General Douglas MacArthur's invasion force, which is storming the island of Leyte. 3 minutes later at 7:13 AM, a lookout aboard Zuikaku spots a US Navy scout aircraft, which can only mean that an overwhelming enemy strike will soon be inbound. This will be the final battle for Japan's once great aircraft carriers. While Ozawa's carriers are rounding Cape Engano, a desperate naval battle is taking place far to the south off the island of Samar. Unbeknownst to Ozawa, his diversion could not have worked better. The US 3rd Fleet under the command of Admiral Bull Halsey had spotted his decoy force the previous day, and raced north to engage what he believes is the main Japanese fleet. In doing so, Halsey left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded, which allowed Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force to infiltrate the Leyte Gulf. With his mission accomplished, the only thing left for Vice Admiral Ozawa's northern force is to face Halsey's massive fleet with Japan's remaining carriers. Ozawa will tell his American interrogators after the war that, "I expected complete destruction of my fleet, but if Kurita's mission was carried out, that was all I wished." The day before, Northern Force launched 75 aircraft, the bulk of its offensive punch against Third Fleet's carriers, but did no damage to any American warships. Today, the 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 9 light cruisers, and 58 destroyers of the US Third Fleet are preparing for battle against the 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 2 carrier battleship hybrids, 3 light cruisers, and 10 destroyers of the Japanese Northern Force. For Task Force 38's commander Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher and Admiral Halsey, this is the moment they have been waiting for. After Ozawa's force slipped away after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Halsey resolved to destroy the Japanese fleet once and for all when he got the opportunity. Now he believes he is about to deal the final blow to Japan's navy. Aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, Executive Officer Thomas Hamilton drafts the order of the day, writing, "Today may be the biggest in our Navy's history. Enterprise will set the pace." However, Halsey and Mitcher are unaware that Imperial Japan's carrier force is a mere shadow of its former self. Ozawa's decoy force is a relatively weak formation of warships. More importantly, the 4 carriers have been stripped of most of their air wings, which have instead been sent to land bases in the Philippines. The Japanese Northern Force can only field 117 aircraft, almost entirely manned by untrained and untested pilots. They stand no chance against Task Force 38, which boasts between 600 and 1,000 aircraft piloted by veterans of the Pacific War. Ozawa believes that this battle is already a foregone conclusion. Having detected the Japanese fleet at around 1 AM on the 25th of October, Admiral Halsey had ordered Task Force 34, comprising 6 fast battleships, to draw ahead of Task Force 38 and make haste towards the enemy. He intends for Task Force 38's airstrikes to be followed by the heavy fire of Task Force 34's battleships. Shortly after 6 AM, Admiral Mitcher gave the order to launch scout aircraft as well as the first strike group of 180 aircraft. Although Mitcher does not have a precise bearing on the enemy fleet, he wants his aviators to be ready to hit them as soon as they are detected. The 60 Hellcat fighters, 65 Helldiver bombers, and 55 Avenger torpedo aircraft are vectored 50 miles to the north and circle until 7:13 AM, when a scout Hellcat fighter reports the position of the Japanese fleet. The Northern Force is 140 miles to the north of the US Third Fleet, and with perfect flying weather. Led by Commander Dave McCampbell, who scored 9 kills in a dogfight the previous day, the American strike group sets off towards their target. The last battle fought between aircraft carriers in the Second World War is about to begin. Commander McCampbell and the American strike group are detected by Japanese radar at 8:17 AM, and Ozawa launches whatever fighters he has left. 10 minutes later, the 180 US Navy aircraft are spotted on the horizon, and 30 Japanese Zeros are vectored to intercept the incoming force. The Japanese warships open fire with everything they have, including Sanshikidan, or beehive anti-aircraft shells, which explode amongst the incoming aircraft. Some American aviators will recall this being the heaviest flak they have ever encountered, even worse than their attack on the super battleships Musashi and Yamato. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol also pounces on the formation, shooting down an Avenger and damaging several other aircraft. Yet, the fearsome Hellcats quickly get to work breaking up the interceptors, shooting down almost every single enemy aircraft. It is not known how many of the 30 Zeros survived the encounter, but very few are able to limp back to bases in the Philippines. With the Combat Air Patrol dealt with, the dive bombers and torpedo aircraft begin their attack runs on the Japanese warships. The first victim is the destroyer Akitsuki, which is set upon at 8:37 AM. A Helldiver drops a 1,000-pound bomb which penetrates and explodes directly in the engine room, cutting power to the rest of the ship. The resulting fires cause secondary explosions, and Akitsuki sinks in less than 10 minutes. Avenger torpedo aircraft from VT-4 of the USS Essex attack the hybrid carrier battleship Issei, which carries no aircraft. Although the American pilots claim 3 hits, it is later revealed that all of the torpedoes missed. Meanwhile, Commander McCampbell directs 12 Helldivers to attack the light carrier Shitose, which narrowly survived destruction at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. She is not so lucky this time, as the Helldivers plant 8 bombs across the length of her flight deck. Avengers also drop torpedoes and score 2 hits on Chitose's port side. The ship's captain, Commander Kanji Yano, works in vain to save the ship, but more Helldivers from USS Lexington drop another 4 bombs into her burning flight deck. With Chitose a burning wreck, the order is given to abandon ship. She will sink an hour later, taking 904 men with her, including Commander Yano. At this point, American pilots have noticed that the Japanese carriers seem to be devoid of any aircraft. More torpedo aircraft from the USS San Jacinto and Belleau Wood move in to attack the light cruiser Tama, which is trying in vain to protect Chitose. A single torpedo impacts the No. 2 boiler room, which temporarily leaves the ship dead in the water. Emergency repairs are able to restore propulsion, but Tama soon falls behind the rest of the formation, and she is eventually forced to limp back towards Japan on her own. The light carrier Zuiho is targeted by Helldivers from the USS Enterprise. Despite evasive maneuvers, Zuiho is struck by a 500-pound bomb, which jams the rear elevator and knocks out the rudder. 3 more near misses cave in the side of her hull, and Zuiho develops a list, but her damage control teams are able to successfully restore steering and fight the fires. By 8:55 am, the list has been righted and she remains floating. To Zuiho's starboard is Ozawa's flagship and Japan's last operational fleet carrier, Zuikaku. As the last remaining carrier from the attack on Pearl Harbor, Zuikaku has survived many close calls and has earned a reputation as a lucky ship. This time, 40 Helldivers and 10 Avengers line up on her, determined to finally send Zuikaku to the bottom. Rear Admiral Takeo Kaizuka orders the ship to flank speed as she desperately attempts to evade the incoming attackers. Zuikaku manages to outmaneuver 2 torpedoes, while her crew puts up a large blanket of anti-aircraft fire. However, Helldivers plant at least 4 bombs into the flight deck, causing extensive damage to the hangar bay. Almost simultaneously, a torpedo impacts the port side, which knocks out the rudder and shorts the switchboard control. The carrier develops a marked list, while her speed drops from 24 knots to barely 10 knots as a result of the damage. Nonetheless, her damage control party is able to restore power to the ship and correct the list by 9 am. Zuikaku's reputation as a lucky ship is still intact, as the first wave of American aircraft leave the scene. However, more US Navy aircraft arrive to attack the northern force at just after 10 am. The second wave is much smaller than the first, comprising 36 aircraft from the USS Lexington, Franklin and Langley, after problems coordinating the strike. Luckily for the Americans, this battle is taking place at relatively close range between the 2 fleets for an aircraft carrier engagement, so Admiral Mitcher's pilots quickly find the Japanese fleet. With limited aircraft, the second wave mostly concentrates on the light carrier Chiyoda. 6 Helldivers from Lexington and Franklin nose over to attack the carrier and score 4 direct hits. Chiyoda loses power and begins to drift out of formation, while the rest of the aircraft attack the wounded Zuiho but score no hits. The second wave departs as Admiral Ozawa transfers his flag from Zuikaku to the light cruiser Oyodo to take advantage of its better communication center. Meanwhile, a full-blown crisis has overtaken Admiral Halsey's flagship, the battleship USS New Jersey. Earlier that morning, Commander of the US 7th Fleet, Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, had asked Halsey if Vice Admiral Willis Lee's fast battleships were blocking the San Bernardino Strait, to which Halsey replied in the negative, confident that he had made the right decision in chasing the enemy carriers. At 8:22 am, Kinkaid radios Admiral Halsey. Fast battleships are urgently needed immediately at Leyte Gulf. Over the next hour, Kinkaid sends increasingly desperate updates about the plight of Task Unit Taffy 3, as they grapple with an overwhelming enemy surface force. At 10 am, Kinkaid transmits in the clear with no decryption, simply asking, "Where is Lee? Send Lee." Halsey does not fully grasp the situation, and tells Kinkaid that it is simply too late for him to do anything. At Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Commander-in-Chief Admiral Chester Nimitz has been monitoring the situation and is also growing concerned. He decides to send Halsey a message asking where the battleships of Task Force 34 are located. The message reads, "Turkey trots to water. Where is Task Force 34, the world wonders. As part of US Navy cryptography, the first 4 and the last 3 words are intended to serve as irrelevant padding to confuse Japanese codebreakers. However, the message decoder on the USS New Jersey did not delete the padding phrases, leading Halsey to believe that Nimitz is reprimanding him. A furious Halsey throws his cap on the ground and begins sobbing. His chief of staff shakes him by the shoulders and shouts, "Stop it, what the hell's the matter with you? Pull yourself together." After calming down, Halsey orders Task Force 34 south to support Taffy 3, but his light escorts will need refueling before they can impact the battle. As such, Kincaid's warships will have to fend for themselves, while the heavy surface ships of 3rd Fleet slowly make their way towards the island of Samar. In the meantime, Admiral Mitch's fleet carriers will continue to pound the decoy Japanese carrier force. A 3rd American strike group of 160 aircraft head for Ozawa's northern force at noon. At this point, Ozawa is retiring to the north as fast as possible, having completed his task of luring the US 3rd Fleet away from Leyte. The last remaining 9 Zero fighters have run out of fuel and are forced to ditch in the ocean because of the damage to the carrier flight decks. Lagging behind the main formation is the light carrier Chiyoda, which is being towed by the cruiser Isuzu. When radar detects the incoming 3rd wave, Ozawa orders Isuzu back to the main formation to provide anti-aircraft fire, leaving Chiyoda behind. At 1:15 PM, the American aircraft spot their targets through the cloud layer. Strike Commander Theodore Winters ignores the crippled Japanese warships and directs most of the attackers towards Zuikaku, which is now making 24 knots again. Finally, her string of luck is at an end. Almost 100 dive bombers and torpedo aircraft from Lexington and Essex bear down on her. At least 5 bomb hits are scored, while the Avengers launch an anvil attack. 6 torpedoes slam into her, sealing the ship's fate. At 1:27 PM, Rear Admiral Kaizuka gives the order for all men to assemble on the flight deck before abandoning ship. As the carrier lists to port, Kaizuka addresses his crew for the final time, and each man salutes as the Imperial Navy ensign is lowered. Zuikaku, the last Japanese fleet carrier, will sink 2.5 hours later with the loss of 842 men, including Rear Admiral Kaizuka. Seeing that Zuikaku is finished, Commander Winters directs the attack aircraft from the Enterprise, San Jacinto and Franklin against Zuiho, which can barely maneuver after the damage suffered earlier in the battle. Avengers from Enterprise's VT-6 hit her with a torpedo directly under the bridge, wounding Captain Kuro Sugiura. The onslaught continues for another 10 minutes. Helldivers score 2 direct hits with bombs and 7 near misses, which force the carrier to reduce speed. Another torpedo strikes the starboard side, which further wrecks the hull beneath the waterline. Zuiho comes to a halt and begins to drift as the pumps are overwhelmed by inrushing seawater. Around this time, Admiral Mitcher is informed that Task Force 38 is now just 60 miles from the nearest enemy warships of Northern Force. He orders his carriers to halt, while sending a force of cruisers and destroyers ahead to engage the remnants of the Japanese fleet in a surface battle. The 3rd American Strike Wave returns to its carriers, while Commander Winters stays behind to document the results of the attack. He watches as the aircraft carrier Zuikaku, veteran of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Guadalcanal, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, capsizes and sinks. The US Navy has finally settled a long-standing score. Zuiho continues to list. By 2:10 PM, every sailor has been called to work the pumps in an attempt to save the ship. However, the 4th wave arrives at just before 3 PM to finish off the rest of the Japanese carriers. This is a smaller attack that targets the stricken Zuiho. She stands no chance as Helldivers score several more direct hits, and Avengers strike the small carrier with 2 torpedoes. At 3:10 PM, the wreckage of Zuiho slips beneath the surface, taking 215 men with her. The crippled Chiyoda is now the last remaining Japanese aircraft carrier in Northern Force. As Winters is returning to base, he spots 4 American cruisers and 10 destroyers coming over the horizon towards Chiyoda, which is dead in the water and without any protection. Winters orbits above the doomed light carrier and radios coordinates to the cruisers, while assuring them that there are no Japanese battleships lurking in the area. At 4:25 PM, the heavy cruisers Wichita and New Orleans open fire from a range of 20,000 yards and are soon joined by the light cruisers Santa Fe and Mobile. Chiyoda quickly takes several hits and returns fire with her 8 1-inch anti-aircraft guns, but the rounds fall well short. Within 15 minutes, she is a burning wreck as the American destroyers prepare for a torpedo attack. But just as the destroyers are about to launch their torpedoes at 4:47 PM, Chiyoda rolls over and sinks. Survivors are seen in the water, but the American warships are refused permission to rescue them as they pursue the rest of the Japanese fleet. Of the 1,470 officers and men aboard Chiyoda, there are no known survivors. The fifth and final wave of American aircraft overtakes the fourth wave as they head back to base. This strike group is composed of 96 aircraft from Essex, Lexington, Langley and Enterprise, and arrives over the remnants of Ozawa's fleeing northern force at 5:30 PM. With no more aircraft carriers left, the pilots decide to focus on the converted battleship carriers, Issei and Hyuga. The American aircraft dive in, but lack of daylight hampers the bombing of the Japanese vessels. Despite claiming 37 confirmed hits on the two battleships, it is revealed after the war that neither Issei nor Hyuga were directly struck by American bombs. The last wave of US Navy aircraft leave without scoring a single hit, but the battle is still not over. In fact, it is an American submarine that will claim the next victim. USS Jalal is on her first wartime patrol when she picks up a nearby contact on radar while surfaced. Her skipper, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Eisenhower, gives chase and eventually comes across the wounded light cruiser Tama, which is limping northwards at reduced speed. Eisenhower lines up the shot from 1,000 yards away and fires 3 bow torpedoes, but all miss. He then fires a salvo of 4 torpedoes from just 800 yards away. At this close range, it is almost impossible for Jalal to miss. 3 of the 4 torpedoes impact Tama, which breaks in half and sinks. All 450 Japanese sailors aboard are lost. Other US submarines attempt to ambush Ozawa's fleet, but no more hits are scored. Meanwhile, the advanced formation of American cruisers and destroyers are continuing their pursuit. As dusk falls over the battlefield, the Japanese northern force is now strung out over an area of about 45 miles. Aided by night fighters from the carrier USS Essex, the American cruisers and destroyers discover a group of 3 Japanese destroyers and 1 light cruiser, which are picking up survivors from the sunken aircraft carriers. The US warships open fire at 6:52 PM, surprising the Japanese. Aboard the destroyer Hatsuzuki, Captain Shigetaka Amano decides to lead an aggressive but fatal charge against the larger American force, to allow the rest of the Japanese vessels to escape. Hatsuzuki turns towards the cruisers and maneuvers as if she is launching torpedoes. Although she has no torpedoes, the American formation is forced to temporarily turn away. For the next 2 hours, Hatsuzuki trades fire with the American force, while Captain Amano continues to repeat the torpedo attack maneuver. This allows the rest of the Japanese fleet to get away, but Hatsuzuki eventually takes multiple hits from American main batteries. Minutes before 9 PM, the burning destroyer explodes and sinks, taking all but 8 of the 280 men aboard with her. Hatsuzuki's sacrifice finally marks the end of the battle off Cape Engano. The Imperial Japanese Navy has lost 4 carriers, a light cruiser, and 2 destroyers, along with 4,200 men. The US Navy has lost only 12 aircraft in what will be the final carrier battle of the Second World War. The Battle of Leyte Gulf officially comes to an end the following day, as American aircraft continue to hunt down the retreating Japanese warships scattered throughout the Philippines. The destroyer Nowaki is the last ship destroyed on the 26th of October, bringing an end to one of the largest naval battles in history. After 3 days of battle involving 360 vessels, the Japanese Navy has lost 28 ships and 13,000 men, while the United States has lost 7 ships and 3,000 men. Despite suffering heavy losses, Especially amongst the ships of Taffy III, the Allies will maintain their dominance of the Pacific Ocean. Japan's last attempt at turning the tide of the war at sea has failed, and the Imperial Japanese Navy has ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. With its naval power finally extinguished, the Japanese will now resort to more desperate measures, including the use of kamikaze. Admiral Bull Halsey's actions during the Battle of the Leyte Gulf have been heavily scrutinised, specifically his decision to leave the San Bernardino Strait undefended in order to chase the Japanese decoy force. Halsey is not reprimanded and remains in command of the US Third Fleet for the rest of the war. Some historians, such as James Hornfisher, contend that Halsey was justified in chasing what he believed to be the main Japanese force, but the commander of Taffy III, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, will never forgive Halsey. The two men later meet in person, where Halsey tells Sprague, "I want you to know I think you wrote the most glorious page in American naval history that day." The commander of Taffy III will forever refer to Halsey as the gentleman who failed to keep his appointment that October. It will be another 2 months until Douglas MacArthur's Allied forces secure Leyte, which essentially severs Japan's access to its occupied territories in the Dutch East Indies. The capture of Leyte also opened the door for the reconquest of the Philippines and the invasion of Okinawa in April of 1945. There, the Japanese Navy launches one final attack with the largest warship in the world of the time, the super battleship Yamato. It will be the last desperate gasp of the dying empire.